Hello, everyone. Hope our last few days of class are going well. Nathan, Mary, and I definitely had a great time putting together this top presentation on the Kobe, Japan earthquake in 1995 and the later 2011 earthquake and tsunami that generally hit most of the uh, eastern Japanese coastline. So I'll start off by talking a bit about the topography of Japan. Basically, the Japanese archipelago is made up of 6,852 islands. A lot of small ones, but there's basically Honshu is the bigger one. That's the main island where Tokyo is. And it's near in terms of plates, as you can see in the top right graphic. The Pacific plate uh, is to its right. The Philippine Sea plate is to its bottom. And basically, it's the North American and Eurasian plate to its left, but they kind of distinct them, some smaller plates in between, the Amerindian plate and the Okhotsk plate to the north. And Japan sits in the Ring of Fire, as you can see in the bottom right. Uh, Basically, that whole ring of subducting plates. Uh, and though it lacks volcanic activity, there's no major active or recently active volcanoes as compared to the rest of the Ring of Fire. But the Pacific Plate generally is quite active. Since 1900, there's been over 50 earthquakes of magnitude 7 and above. And basically, in terms of the subduction, we talk about that. As you can see here, this is the subduction of the Pacific and Filipino plate under mainland Japan, mostly Pacific for Honshu, which is the main island. The red dots are earthquakes of 5 magnitude or greater from 1964 to 2007, with the big, massive 9.0/9.1 in 2011 being that big red dot. And below 70 meters here is marked in green. So you can definitely see there's a big spread throughout, and you can see the volcanic arc is present. And just a quick note in terms of the subduction, you can see how the Philippine Sea Plate and the Pacific Plate both subduct under the mainland continental plates. But interestingly enough, the Pacific Plate also subducts underneath the Philippine Plate, which has a different dynamic as well. And so talk about the 1995 Kobe earthquake. It's also called the Great Henshin earthquake based on its location. It's a smaller magnitude, only 6.9. And basically, what made it so devastating was the fact that it was so close to the city of Kobe. It was rated a 10 on the modified Mercalli intensity scale, which means extreme effects such as well-built wooden structures fall, rails bend, most masonry and frame structures destroyed. And tremors only lasted 20 seconds, so a lot of destruction happened in little time. So again, it was super close to the city, even though it was 6.9. It was 20 kilometers away from the city of Kobe. And the hypocenter was only 17 kilometers below the surface. And here is actually what's called an inland shallow earthquake, where it is not that common because most of Japan's on the subduction plates. But this is inland, where there's some strike slip earthquakes that occur. As you can see in the bottom right, the Japan median tectonic line is basically a fault across Japan where these strike slips occur. And as you see in the top right, you can see the epicenter and where it's centered and spread in terms of ground movement. And it was an east-west strike slip movement. Most of that sort is in that area. And yes, that is it. Continuing on with my group mate here.
Okay, I covered the human effect of the earthquake, the devastating human effect in the city of Kobe in 1995 was due to being the nearest location to the epicenter, what Nash was saying. With its large population of 1.5 million inhabitants, the earthquake caused severe human suffering to individuals directly impacted by the event and a strong sense of grief among family members who lost parents and then some became orphans. For the next slide, I put Kobe, the buildings were constructed in ways that contributed to the $200 billion damage caused by the earthquake. For example, older houses were designed to withstand typhoons and were made heavier, almost weighing up to 2 tons. The tremors from the earthquake produced massive pancake collapses to the frail walls and flooring. So the earthquake also caused the liquefaction triggered effect among the many buildings and essential seaports installations in Kobe. So when the earth moved and shook, it kind of, made it, the areas, sink in and then just fall over or that kind of damage. And then the highways and subways were deemed safe due to the 1960s code designs that were built with the reinforced concrete steel. New revisions that occurred up to 1981 focused on the construction code designs to fix previous defects in the structure of these installations. However, the government revisions were past due when the earthquake hit, and then it caused damage to the public transportation, affecting the local economy. So that's what I have for the property.
Yeah. So now moving on to some post-earthquake responses. It was notable after the 1995 Kobe earthquake that government response was really slow, and this was due to the complete destruction of communication and transportation system. The power and water lines were also destroyed, but power was up very quickly. However, the water supply took a long time to fix, which limited medical response. And however, even though there was not a lot of government or not a lot of quick government response, there was a lot of non-government response, and these were very, very crucial and very, very timely as well. For example, it's notable that the crime ring Yamaguchi Gumi was very, very actively involved in immediate aid. And this was considered particularly crucial in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake because of the failure of the Japanese government to organize effective relief to the area initially. 7-Eleven started to provide supplies in the immediate area, and Motorola provided free telephone service to victims. And after the 1995 earthquake, buildings and road code changed. For example, Japanese authorities started to place rubber blocks under buildings and passed a bill that authorized special forces to be deployed in the event of a major earthquake. And in public parks as well, earthquake-proof shelters and supplies were also stocked up. And that's mainly the government response or the lack thereof. Now, what's really interesting is the other response, such as the literary response and the cultural response caused by the 1995 Kobe earthquake. We've seen a lot of volunteerism ever since the 1995 Kobe earthquake. It's widely considered as a turning point for volunteerism as a form of civic engagement. And January 17th, which is when the Kobe earthquake happened, was even declared as a National Disaster Prevention and Volunteerism Day. So you see that ever since the Kobe earthquake happened in 1995, we've seen a lot of volunteerism and Japanese people volunteering as a form of civic engagement ever since. In terms of the literary response, Haruki Murakami, a very prominent Japanese author, published his novel After the Quake, which was set in 1995 Kobe. It's a collection of short stories that explored the Japanese national conscience, and especially how the 1995 Kobe earthquake affected it. It reveals exactly how emotionally and spiritually damaging the Kobe earthquake was, and is a reminder of the legacy of the devastating effects of 1995. He uses a very brutal yet absurd style of writing, and this is intended to mimic the effect of the Kobe earthquake, where the reader feels so disoriented and shocked that like the ground under their feet feels shaky, and they feel very disoriented, like as if they were an earthquake. So that's a very cool effect that I feel like is unique to this work. Yeah, and this very, very popular set of short stories serves as a legacy of the devastation of 1995, kind of immortalizing it in a great literary work.
So then now we're going to talk about the 2011 Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and then later we'll contrast the two quakes and quake/tsunami. So this one was a bit larger, obviously. The scale 9.0 to 9.1, also a 10 on the modified Mercalli scale, even though the focus was actually 72 kilometers east of the Honshu sea coast, basically. And it was it was an undersea megathrust earthquake, so subduction occurred, and it lasted 6 minutes, causing the tsunami we've heard so much about as well. It was the most powerful earthquake in the known history of Japan, and it's been the fourth biggest worldwide since 1900, when we really kept keeping track of these things, behind Chile in 9.5 in 1960, 9.2 in Alaska in 1964, and 9.1 in 2004 off the coast of Sumatra. So this is in common. Waves reach heights of up to 40.5 meters or 132 feet, but obviously it varied throughout in terms of actual size based on where it was, but those were the highest points. It traveled at 700 kilometers an hour or 435 miles per hour, which is kind of similar to the numbers we talked about in class. What was so devastating about it, and how it had long and tough effects, was how far inland it traveled, which we'll talk about the effects in a bit. And we talk about in class a lot about how tsunamis, you can sometimes have warning if it's further away. But unfortunately, 72 kilometers away, coastal residents had 8 to 10 minutes of warning before it hit. And it also caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which we'll also talk about. And in terms of the earthquake and its background, interesting thing is that it was semi-predicted due to the Senriku earthquake in year 869, where there was an 8.4. This was an 8.4 earthquake, and around that time, and through deposits of tsunamis, which were identified from the last 3,000 years, pointed that one occurred every 800 to 1100 years. So in 2007, it was predicted that to 99% certainty that a large earthquake that would cause a tsunami would happen in the next 30 years. So obviously, what are you going to do if you know it's happening in 30 years? It's hard to prepare, as people live on the coast. There's fishing towns that need to be near the water. So it's very tough to actually prepare for such a devastating earthquake. But it's interesting that we're getting closer in terms of predicting some of these natural disasters. In terms of how it occurred, it's the Pacific plate subducting underneath northern Honshu. It was a seismic slip rupture event causing the seafloor to rise. Seafloor subducted, causing the tsunami. And there's also an eastward movement of 8 feet of the entire island of Honshu. It had a length of 500 kilometers and a width of 200 kilometers. And as we've done some of these calculations in terms of the tsunami or earthquake magnitude, those numbers are quite high. And in these terms on the right, you can see the epicenter as to the right of Honshu and near the plate. And basically you can see as it subducts under the ground, the plate basically moves, the Pacific plate moves 8 centimeters a year towards Japan. So, and the slip was around 10 to 20 meters and 30 meters max in some places.
Okay, and then the human effects, like what Nash was saying, it was pretty high. The death toll during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami was due to several factors, which was the earthquake tremors, significant water surge from the tsunami that overtopped the seawalls. They had seawalls and it just overcame them. The Japanese government had tsunami warnings in every city near the shores. However, some residents, they didn't notice the warning signs or they just ignored them. For example, 8 to 10 minute warnings were issued to the city of Sendai. When the tsunami hit, the people of Sendai City were already in like snow and freezing temperatures. So the the temperature was pretty bad for them when it hit. For the next slide, the damage caused by the combination of the earthquake and tsunami in 2011 included like 59 miles from the Sendai, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant built-in systems detected the earthquake and it automatically shut down the nuclear reactors. As the emergency diesels generators turned on to keep the coolant pumping around the cores, the tsunami waves over like 14 meters struck the nuclear power plant, knocking out emergency generators. The nuclear fuel overheated and caused 3 of the reactors to have meltdowns. The discharge of the radiation leaked in the Fukushima's water and caused hundreds of thousands of residents to evacuate from their area. The cooling systems were no longer working due to many electrical generators running out of fuel, which caused overheating. So due to no ventilation, the gas built up within the reactor containment structures, leading to several explosions. And then at least 16 workers were injured in this explosion, on top of the devastations of the 360 billion damages and things like that. So
Cool. Yeah, and now let's talk about the responses to the Great Tohoku earthquake. We see that as opposed to the 1995 Kobe earthquake, there was a significantly stronger government response to the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. The Japanese self-defense forces were immediately mobilized. There was widespread distribution of supplies, and there was a shutdown of nuclear plants in the region. We've just seen that this wasn't 100% effective, but the government did attempt to shut down all the nuclear power plants in the region. And compared to the 1995 Kobe earthquake, there was a notable lack of disorder because Japanese authority was much more felt. And what's also interesting is that, as seen in 1995 as well, crime syndicates began enforcing order in their territories and helping out in their communities, which is really surprising to see. But in general, we see a Japanese deference to national authority during this 2011 earthquake, as well as a national desire to see civility prevail. If we move on, yep. And moreover, not only do we see a strong national response, but we've seen a strong international and humanitarian response to the 2011 earthquake as well. 128 countries and 33 international organizations offered assistance to Japan, including Australia, China, India, New Zealand, South Korea, and the United States. The Japanese Red Cross received more than $1 billion in donations and sent more than 200 search and rescue teams, which helped spark such a strong response to the earthquake. In general, response was more organized in 2011 than 1995, with larger organizations participating in relief efforts with faster response times. So it could be said that the 1995 Kobe earthquake response was more of a bottom-up approach, while the earthquake response in 2011 was more of a top-down approach.
Great. And in terms of contrasting the two, we know that the 95 quake was a strike slip fault earthquake rather than a subduction of the 2011 earthquake. So in terms of looking at the dangers of both, obviously with strike slip, we have watched San Andreas, where the results can be quite extreme if we're to believe the results of San Andreas. But what can be more dangerous and more commonly dangerous in terms of size are these subduction zones, where you can have these 9.0 and above magnitude quakes that commonly cause these tsunamis. Not commonly, obviously, as it has happened a few times, but if there's a undersea subduction quake, if it's large enough, you would assume something or other would happen. And in terms of the contrasting the two, Nathan hit it pretty well in terms of the government response and how they differed between the two. What's also interesting is in terms of predictability, where scientists were able to understand that a quake was coming within the next 30 years, whereas so many of these strike slip quakes happen that it is kind of random. You can just kind of know where they're going to happen along that Japanese fault. And then also just the location of the epicenter is key. The earthquake in Kobe was only so devastating because it was so close to the city. Uh, and in terms of the 2011 quake, because it happened far out enough in the water, there was a bit of a time where people could respond with that 8 to 10 minute warning. Whereas, and it's important, if it's further out, you have more time. If it's closer, you have less time. So that's just something interesting we've thought about. But that brings us to a close. I think that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you.
Thank you.